He was tall, charming, and impossibly handsome, the golden boy of 1952nd Hollywood. To the world, Rock Hudson was the perfect leading man. Women adored him, studios banked on him, and America believed in him. But behind the glitz, he was harboring a truth that could destroy everything. While fans saw him kiss Doris Day on screen and smile through press tours, Rock was living a carefully constructed lie built by the very system that made him famous. A system that controlled who he loved, how he behaved, and even who he married. His life wasn't just scripted on film, it was scripted off camera too. Then in 1985, a single announcement shattered the illusion. Rock Hudson was dying, and the cause, a disease no one in America dared to speak of. Suddenly, the idol of a generation became the face of a terrifying epidemic, and the truth Hollywood had hidden for decades came crashing down. This is not just the story of a movie star, it's the story of a man forced to trade authenticity for survival, and a town that demanded silence in return for success. But the truth behind it is much darker. Before he was Rock Hudson, he was Roy Harold Scherer Jr., a shy, awkward boy growing up in the industrial town of Winnetka, Illinois. Born in 1925, during the Great Depression, Roy's early years were shaped by instability and silence. His father, an auto mechanic, abandoned the family when Roy was just a child, leaving a void that would haunt him for decades. His mother remarried a man who never truly accepted Roy as his own. The boy who would become one of Hollywood's most desired faces was, in his own home, invisible. He spent much of his youth in solitude, retreating into fantasies and movie magazines, dreaming of a world far from the quiet shame of his reality. He rarely spoke about his childhood, but those close to him described it as cold and emotionally barren. There was something different about Roy, even as a teenager. He towered over his classmates, but rarely raised his voice. He loved drama, but never joined the school plays, perhaps out of fear of standing out too much or being seen too clearly. Deep down, he knew he wasn't like the other boys. And in 1932nd America, that difference was dangerous. He graduated high school with no clear path forward. After a brief stint in the Navy during World War II, where he served in the Philippines, Roy returned home drifting. He worked odd jobs, truck driver, mail sorter, until one day, someone told him he had a face made for the movies. It was the kind of comment that stuck. And yet, behind his chiseled jaw and gentle eyes was a young man still aching for belonging, still pretending, still wondering if he'd ever be able to live truthfully without risking everything. Before the fame, before the lights, there was just a boy named Roy, quiet, observant, carrying secrets he didn't yet have words for. Hollywood in the late 1942nd was a machine, glamorous, ruthless, and hungry for the next face to shape into a star. When Roy Scherer arrived in Los Angeles, he didn't have acting experience, a resume, or even a proper headshot. What he had was presence. Towering at 6'4", with a voice like velvet and a smile that seemed to glow from within, he turned heads without saying a word. One of those heads belonged to Henry Wilson, a notorious talent agent known for manufacturing stars. Wilson saw more than just potential in Roy. He saw marketability. Within weeks, Roy was reborn. His new name? Rock Hudson. Strong, American, masculine. Every syllable screamed box office gold. But the transformation wasn't just in name. Wilson trained Rock in posture, in speech, even in how to kiss on camera. He was coached to become the embodiment of heterosexual desire. Behind the scenes, Hudson was warned to keep his private life buried. One whisper, Wilson reportedly said, "And it's over." The ascent was slow but deliberate. Rock took bit parts in forgettable B-movies, sometimes delivering just one line. He stumbled through scripts and flubbed takes, but the camera loved him. And by the early 1000s, 952nd, so did America. His breakthrough came with Magnificent Obsession in 1954, followed by All That Heaven Allows and Giant, where he starred opposite Elizabeth Taylor and James Dean. Critics praised his performances, but more importantly, audiences fell in love with the image Rock Hudson, the rugged but sensitive man every woman wanted and every man wanted to be. Universal Studios invested heavily in his image, making him their top contract star. He was everywhere on red carpets, magazine covers, talk shows, and always there was a beautiful woman on his arm, carefully chosen by publicists to maintain the illusion. It was Hollywood at its most orchestrated, but beneath the tailored suits and charming interviews, Rock was living in constant fear. He attended parties but rarely stayed long. He gave interviews but revealed nothing. He dated women in public and men in private, always watching, always cautious. Still, for a time, the lie worked. The world adored Rock Hudson. He was wealthier than he'd ever imagined, but the higher he rose, the more precarious the act became. He wasn't just playing a role on screen. He was playing one in real life, too, and the stakes were far greater. By the mid-1962nd, Rock Hudson had become more than a star. He was an institution. But beneath the glossy magazine covers and box office hits was a man living a life fractured in two. He couldn't walk into a bar without scanning the room for photographers. He couldn't share a home with someone he loved. He couldn't tell the truth, not to the public, not to the press, and often not even to himself. Hollywood was built on illusion, but for Rock, it was a prison. His sexuality was the industry's worst-kept secret, whispered at parties, joked about in coded Hollywood slang, but never acknowledged publicly. For studio executives, it was a liability that had to be managed. So they created distractions. In 1955, Rock was pressured into a short-lived marriage with Phyllis Gates, his agent's secretary. The wedding was splashed across the tabloids, presented as the romantic fairy tale America craved. But behind closed doors, the marriage was cold and strained. Within 3 years, it ended in divorce. Phyllis would later claim she didn't know he was gay. Others close to the situation believed she was fully aware and part of the cover. Rock returned to bachelor life, but the surveillance only grew tighter. Paparazzi followed him. Studio handlers monitored his movements. Friends were vetted. Lovers were hidden. He lived in constant paranoia that one slip photograph, a jilted partner, a drunken conversation could end everything. He turned to alcohol, often drinking alone. The pressure of pretending for so long took its toll. While his early films celebrated him as a romantic hero, later roles began to reflect a more complex, sometimes broken man, perhaps a mirror of what he couldn't say out loud. In the 1972nd, as his leading man appeal began to fade, Rock transitioned to television. He found success on shows like Macmillan and Wife, but the spotlight was dimming. The industry that once worshipped him was moving on, and with fewer cameras around, the mask began to crack. In private, Rock was finally allowing himself to live more authentically, at least in small, quiet ways. He had long-term partners, traveled more freely, and built a circle of trusted friends. But the decades of secrecy had left scars. Friends described him as gentle but guarded, warm but withdrawn. He smiled in interviews, but rarely opened up. Then, in the early 1982nd, strange symptoms began to appear. Weight loss, chronic fatigue, skin lesions. Rock avoided doctors for as long as he could, but in 1984, the truth could no longer be ignored. He was diagnosed with AIDS at a time when the disease was still poorly understood and deeply stigmatized. It was called the gay plague in tabloids. Many refused to believe it was real. Others believed those who had it deserved it. For Rock Hudson, it was more than a death sentence. It was the unraveling of the life he had spent decades carefully constructing. He was now the face of everything Hollywood had told him to hide. In July 1985, Rock Hudson stood before cameras in Paris, looking gaunt, frail, and almost unrecognizable. He had flown overseas to receive experimental treatment at a private clinic. But what caught the world's attention was not the treatment, it was the image. The golden icon of Hollywood no longer looked immortal. Just days later, a press release confirmed what many had feared, but few dared say aloud. Rock Hudson was dying of AIDS. It was a cultural earthquake. He became the first major celebrity to publicly acknowledge the disease, and with that revelation, the stigma that had long been whispered in shadows was now shouted from headlines. The world, for the first time, had to confront a crisis it had tried to ignore. But Rock didn't speak. After that press release, he gave no interviews, no television statements. His silence was thunderous. Some believed he was too weak to speak. Others believed he had spent so long hiding that even in his final days, the habit of silence could not be broken. He returned to Los Angeles in September, too ill to walk, slipping in and out of consciousness. Only a few close friends were allowed to visit. Doris Day, his longtime co-star and loyal friend, described seeing him in those final days as the most heartbreaking moment of her life. On the 2nd of October, 1985, Rock Hudson died at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 59 years old. There was no dramatic final monologue, no grand confessional, just a quiet end to a life that had been lived for so long, behind glass. But in death, Rock Hudson said what he never could in life. His passing ignited national headlines and forced the Reagan administration, until then largely silent on the AIDS epidemic, to address the crisis. Millions who had previously believed the disease only affected others now saw it etched on the face of someone they loved. Elizabeth Taylor, devastated by the loss of her dear friend, vowed to continue his fight. She became one of the first major celebrities to champion AIDS research, launching fundraising efforts that would eventually raise hundreds of millions of dollars. But while the world finally began to change, Rock had already paid the price. He had spent decades building a career on roles that weren't truly his. And when the curtain finally fell, it wasn't applause that greeted him. It was a collective gasp, a reckoning, a long overdue awakening. Rock Hudson had died. But the lie Hollywood forced him to live? That was dying too. Rock Hudson was more than a movie star. He was a man forced to live behind a mask, crafted not by choice, but by an industry and a culture that feared the truth. After his death, those who truly knew him began to speak. Doris Day remembered his laugh, his kindness, his deep loyalty. Elizabeth Taylor called him the bravest man she ever knew, and transformed her grief into one of the most powerful advocacy efforts in Hollywood history. In honoring him, she helped shatter the silence he had been trapped in for decades. In the years that followed, Rock's legacy evolved. No longer just the dreamy leading man from Pillow Talk or Giant, he became a symbol of the cost of conformity, a reminder that fame, when built on silence, is not freedom, it's captivity. Today, he is remembered not only for the roles he played, but for the truth he ultimately could not escape. His life and his death opened conversations that had been buried in shame and stigma, conversations that saved lives. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is that Rock Hudson had to die before the world was ready to accept who he really was. And maybe, just maybe, we never truly knew him. We only knew the man on the screen. But behind the camera, behind the myth, was a human being longing to be seen.